The LSU Fighting Tigers report to camp today. They will hit the practice field tomorrow for the first time. Brian Kelly will meet with the media post-practice tomorrow at 6:15. So be on the lookout for any sound coming out of that tomorrow evening, and I'm sure you will hear it in droves on this station on Friday. Plenty of stuff to look forward to with this season. I mean, we've talked about it a lot, really based on the win total, because LSU's win total has just been everywhere, right? There's been so much kind of uncertainty surrounding the team. Obviously, who's going to be the quarterback? So you'll get to see that competition ramp back up. Where do they go at tight end? How does Brian Kelly do in his first year? What's a fair expectation? Just so much surrounding this team. But I will say the number one thing that I'm looking forward to in camp, and we'll go through and talk about a lot of these as they make their way through the fall. But the number one thing that I want to watch from start to finish is how the depth chart develops at cornerback, because cornerback was the biggest hole on this team. They had Radarius Jones and Demarius McGee. Eli Ricks transferred out. Dwight McGlothern transferred out. That's what you were left with. And through the transfer portal and a little bit of recruiting, LSU has gotten depth at corner. Now, how does it kind of come together? Jarek Bernard-Converse feels like the only guy, and if you disagree with this, let me know, feels like the only guy who kind of has a spot locked down, like it's his starting spot to lose. We haven't even really seen him. Remember, he had the Jones fracture in spring, which opened up a lot of competition in that cornerback room, and we'll get to some of the guys who maybe stood out. But first team All Big 12, 4-year starter at Oklahoma State, all those things, Brian Kelly's constantly talked about him as a leader. All of those things kind of lead you to believe that he's got the spot. It's his to lose. But after that, when you look at Sevyn Banks, Makai Garner, Radarius Jones, Demarius McGee, Jordan Allen, LaTerrence Welsh, you have Greg Brooks, who's probably going to play nickel. After JBC, Jarek Bernard-Converse, it feels pretty wide open in the LSU cornerback room.
I agree. I think Welsh is the wild card, obviously, with all the hype he had coming out of high school. I loved how he was tweeting his attitude about, all right, Eli Ricks, all right, McGlothern, y'all want to go? Hey, we're going to take over here. We're going to usher in the new era of DBU. So he's really exciting. I think he's somebody who down the road could earn a spot on this defense. But I think you're right. It all starts with Bernard-Converse. And me and Taylor were actually talking about it last week while you were out. Like, it's unfortunate that LSU lost what they did at cornerback. I think Eli Ricks and McGlothern could be two of the best in the country this season, unfortunately, at other SEC West schools. But if you were going to replace them, I don't think you could have replaced them with two better guys than Sevyn Woods and Jarek Bernard-Converse. And when you talk about Oklahoma State last season, this was a really important player to their success. Lost in the Big 12 title game, but Jarek Bernard-Converse, first team, all Big 12, and that wasn't your common. That wasn't like your older brother's Oklahoma State, right? They won games with their defense. They weren't the run and gun Cowboys that people are used to. And Bernard-Converse was a big part of that. And based on his experience, based on his skins on the wall, I do agree that he has that spot locked up. And I'm excited to see what he can do in Matt House's defense.
Then there's Sevyn Banks, and Sevyn Banks is perhaps the guy I'm most intrigued to see this fall. Starter at Ohio State. The injuries caught up to in his senior year, obviously, but when healthy, he was a starter for Ohio State. And Ohio State's turned out some pretty darn good defensive backs in their day.
Transfer from Ohio State, you say?
Transfer from, the last one worked out pretty well. You look at Sevyn Banks, really versatile, can play inside or outside of the cornerback position. LSU feels good about the medicals, which is major. That's kind of one thing that when he announced intentions to declare for the NFL draft, but after, the injury was maybe a little bit more severe when some teams looked in there, LSU feels good about the medicals. He's another guy we haven't seen yet. He transferred in late. He missed the spring. He was in the portal, so he wasn't doing spring with Ohio State. No spring practice for him at all, but another lengthy guy, 6'2", 205 pounds, on the surface, checks every box. Feels like with the experience he has, another veteran guy could slot in early there as a starting cornerback, but I don't think it's just set in stone because of injuries, because of missing spring. Feels like he's going to have to earn it, but when healthy, could be a great one for LSU. So very intrigued to see him get out there on the field.
Yeah, you saw that if you saw him at Ohio State, played for a good part of 2 seasons over there. And on the surface, like you said, I would think that he would be the starter there. But based on the injury, based on the time he missed, I'm really excited to see if somebody like LaTerrence Welsh can't step on down and take advantage of that situation. And I know Radarius Jones on the surface doesn't seem like the best cornerback in the world, but I thought he did a really good job in a tough situation last season, including playing in that bowl game. So I'm low-key rooting for him a little bit. And Sevyn Banks on the surface, like I said, I would think is going to start there, but he's got some competition, and the injury in the spring probably didn't help him.
So you mentioned you mentioned LaTerrence Welsh is possibly pushing him for a spot. I think Makai Garner is the guy that really could push Sevyn Banks. Another long rangy cornerback, 6'2", 217 is Makai Garner. He's another guy with plenty of experience at ULL. Was a starter there for most of his time. Mentioned it kind of at the top of the segment. Guys were able to have opportunity because of the injury to Jarek Bernard-Converse. Matt House mentioned Makai Garner by name as one of the guys who sees that opportunity most. He got better each day of spring. I think maybe if it's not Sevyn Banks out there week 1 opposite Bernard-Converse, you could be looking at Makai Garner in that spot. And then you kind of just go down the list the rest of the way. Okay, how does the depth fill in behind them? Injuries, if injuries happen. Is it a Radarius Jones who you talked about? Demarius McGee is another guy that Matt House mentioned by name and seizing opportunity with injuries in spring. Jordan Allen is a freshman from LCA that we haven't even mentioned. Came in as a safety. They've officially moved him down to cornerback. He did play a little bit of both at LCA, but was recruited, as a safety. How does he take to that position change at the next level? Then you mentioned him there, LaTerrence Welsh. So they have bodies there now. And it feels very much like Greg Brooks is going to be your starting nickel. Like that's where he was at Arkansas the majority of his career, played really, really well there, has experience in the SEC at that position. That kind of just makes sense. But how the depth fills in behind those three, Bernard-Converse, Sevyn Banks, and Makai Garner. And I picked them because they're the most veteran. They're the transfers you brought in. You brought them in because, one, you needed depth, and two, you probably weren't overly satisfied with kind of what you had on the roster or in the recruiting class. So can the guys returning, Radarius Jones, Demarius McGee, freshman coming in, Jordan Allen, LaTerrence Wells, can they fill in, and how do they fill in behind those guys? Or, as you mentioned plenty with LaTerrence Welsh, does he push for starting time?
Yeah, I trust House's judgment. Whoever earns it is going to get that starting spot. But I guess Makai Garner just isn't as sexy as a choice as some of these younger guys. I mean, like I said, Welsh had so much hype coming in, and all the great kind of cornerbacks that we've seen recently at LSU, Pat Peterson, Trey White, Stingley, amongst others, they kind of popped immediately as a freshman, at least a little bit. So I would like to see that out of LaTerrence Welsh. And I'm also curious to see where Sage Ryan fits in. Like you mentioned, Greg Brooks is probably starting at the nickel. I would think he fills in at his backup right there at the nickel and plays in case of an injury. But he also had a lot of hype coming out of high school, and we didn't see too much of him last season, but I remember when he was being recruited, LSU was playing Auburn in 2020, and there were rumors that Coach O staff at the time was so hard after Sage Ryan that it affected their preparation going into that Auburn game. So some of these young guys in the secondary have a lot of upside. Maybe the veteran experience wins out like you're saying, but there's a lot of potential with some of the younger guys in the secondary, and I'm curious to see how much of it pops off in 2022.
There is, and Sage Ryan performed quite well at nickel for LSU last season. I mean, that was one of the kind of defining moments where the defense took a turn last year. Was when Sage Ryan kind of stepped into that role, and it was again out of necessity with injuries. You ended up with moving Flott to the outside and moving Sage Ryan down into the slot. Another guy who's interesting, and it was asked in the chat about Jordan Tolles, and that's kind of the wild card. And I know Jordan Tolles is a safety, but because of injuries, he played some corner out of necessity in spring, and Matt House was pretty complimentary of what he saw. You haven't really seen much of Jordan Tolles on the field so far at his time at LSU, and it has been a pretty crowded safety room, and that doesn't really change right now. So maybe there is a potential for him to push for some playing time there. I'd consider him more of a wild card there, though, just because it was pretty much kind of out of necessity that Jordan Tolles was playing some cornerback there in the spring, just due to some injuries.
Yeah, you saw his name.
He was complimentary of him.
Yeah.
Matt House.
Like I said, all these guys, I think, deserve a lot of credit for the situation they were put in last season and even going into this offseason. But it'll be interesting to see what he can do. Also, I don't think we can go the whole segment without mentioning Jay Ward. They were considering moving him positions, but he's done a really good job in some really bad defenses the last 2 years. And with the rest of the unit beefing up, with Matt House coming in, I'm curious to see what Jay Ward can do as his final act here at LSU.
I would leave Jay Ward at safety, though. I mean, he's really taken to that position well since he was moved there in the last fall. I believe it was last fall when he moved to safety. He just really took to. He was the only defensive back, it felt like, that stayed healthy all year last year for LSU, minus Cordell Flott.
I would also leave him at safety. I think the football instincts with Jay Ward are just unbelievable. You saw it even as a freshman. He had the big block punt against Arkansas. He's somebody who plays really good in open space. So I would also leave him at safety. And also just in terms of being a veteran leader, I think he takes a big step in that regard this season because people will be looking for him to lead. And this is a defense that has some new faces, has a new coordinator. But like I said, the last few years have been tough on that side of the ball, and Jay Ward has been one of the only constants.
That is very true. I mean, he's been great. So that's kind of very interesting. How does the depth chart develop at cornerback? Probably the thing I'm most interested to see in the fall, because you could say quarterback and sure, whatever, but it's going to be one of the three, and you'll probably see all three of them before the year is over. So that takes a little bit of the intrigue away from that for me, honestly. The guy who takes first snaps might not be the guy starting in 2 weeks. So we'll just wait and see. That I don't know if that's going to really be fully decided when fall camp is over. But cornerback, the depth chart there, it should be. And it should be a very interesting battle.